Morning. Shall I begin? Is that okay? Right, here we go. Nice to see you on my screen, and I hope you've already had a bit of a day. I only just woke up a couple of hours ago. And what I want to do today in the second of these lectures, we got to a mention of Puccini, and we were basically in and around 1900. And I want really to talk about the world of opera in the 20th century. But of course, that's part of a very, very long legacy. I'm going to start by talking a little bit more about Puccini, and then I'll come and chat to you after a few pictures and a little bit of music. And there we go. That's you really didn't need to hear my lectures. All you need to do is read the book, and then you'll know far more than I'm going to tell you now. But I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Puccini, if I can make the technology work. Puccini was one of those people who, I'll keep going. All right, we'll do it like this then. I showed you that picture yesterday at the end of the lecture. As you see, he's born in the 19th century and dies a quarter of the way through the 20th century. He lived to be in his mid-60s. And that's about the most formal picture of him you'll ever see. He was not like Verdi, who always dressed well and was a landowner and wrote operas about kings and emperors and archbishops and military leaders and so on. There's a huge transition between the great operas, the grand operas of the 19th century, and the more human stories, really, of the 20th. It didn't suddenly happen. Nothing in history suddenly happens. But if I'd wanted to meet Verdi, and wouldn't that have been wonderful, I'd have timidly gone up to his grand villa on the edge of the estate that he owned and ran, and I'd have knocked at the door, and his servant would have said, "Yes, sir, what can I do for you?" And I'd have said, "Oh, I just wonder if there's any possibility that I might meet Maestro Verdi. What do you wish to talk to him about? He's very busy at the moment." And there was no way I would have been let in. If I'd seen Puccini, I don't know how good your English is. Do you know, he was a bloke. He was a chap. He was an ordinary fellow. He's a nice man, ran into all sorts of problems in his life. He was living for a long time with the wife of a friend of his. And then eventually they were able to marry, but he had other relationships. He liked to go out on the lake near where he lived, and he would dress very casually. There's a little bit of early film of him. There's even, I found, a recording of his voice. I used to lead opera tours to various places and went to Lucca, where he was born in Tuscany in northern Italy, and Torre del Lago, tower by the lake. There was a lovely little lake he moved to, and he used to go out boating, and he would have drinks with his friends and so on. Very easygoing kind of guy. Let me take you, if I can, to This is Lucca, L-U-C-C-A. This is the town in which he was born. And look at that statue. He's got his legs crossed. He's holding a cigarette. He was always smoking. He's kind of dressed up-ish. Look at the cafe just behind him. You can see it's called Butterfly. You may know his opera, Madame Butterfly, based on a kind of cliche, slightly crude image of a sexy Japanese girl, a geisha. And most of Puccini's operas, not all, but most of them, are named after the principal woman, principal girl in the opera. Madame Butterfly. The first opera that made him famous was Manon Lescaut. Manon Lescaut she's a kind of high-class prostitute, but she falls in love with the man she's having an affair with, and so on. Manon Lescaut, Madame Butterfly, Tosca, Turandot, which we'll talk about later, and so on. And what's interesting is that none of these are, well, Turandot is a great mythological princess, but she's basically a tough woman. He writes about two kinds of women. Either the sweet little loving girl who does whatever her lovely man says and runs into problems. But maybe like in La Bohème, which is about a bunch of students with the girl Mimi, maybe she's very ill and she's finally going to die, and they all weep over this poor sweet girl who dies. Or they are tough, independent-minded, modern feminist women who are determined to get their way, and if their man is under any danger, she will save him or try to save him. One of his earliest operas, one you'll never have heard of, it's never performed these days. He was a student. It was called Edgar. And there are two types of women, There is the sweet, lovely girl, and her name is Fidelia, faithful. And the other, the tough woman, is called Tigrana, sort of tigress, a tiger woman. And you learn a lot about Puccini from the characters that he set in these operas, and the kind of gentle arias for the one and the powerful aria for the other. And in an opera like Madame Butterfly, she begins in the opera very sweet, very lovely, gentle, quiet, and this American sailor comes and seduces her and promises he'll marry her and give her lots of money, and poor girl, she believes it. This is a time when the West, Europe, America, is, as they used to say, rediscovering the Orient. You'll know a little bit about Britain, the Empire, China, attitudes to drugs, opium wars, and so on. A kind of a rediscovery or abuse of the Oriental world, particularly China, particularly Japan. Many operas, exhibitions, architecture, design, a popular comic opera like the Gilbert and Sullivan, The Mikado, which you may know about, written about, all about the same time, same kind of time, late 19th century, early 20th. And Puccini was part of that world. I don't want to make historical judgments and say they were wicked racists or wicked imperialists. They were part of the world at that time, which we have moved way beyond by now. So he writes so many operas about these two types of women, and Madame Butterfly in Act 1 is woman number one. She's the sort of Fidelia, she's the sweet, loving, who believes everything her handsome American man says to her. Realizes during the opera that he was lying. He's not going to marry her. He's going to go back to America and forget about her. And in the final act, the man, the rather arrogant American sailor, and his wife, and they've got their own family in America, they happen to revisit Japan, and she is appalled at how he has lied to her. She becomes really tough, sings totally tougher kind of music, and eventually, very visibly in front of their child, kills herself. Difficult for me. I'm an old, white, European man, and I'm talking now about sex and sexism. Many, many operas of the 19th century, the most famous ones, are about a woman who has a relationship with a man. It might be very loving, it might be very trusting, it might be misled, but again and again, it ends with the poor girl's death. It might be harakiri, suicide, as in Madame Butterfly. It might be like in La Bohème, that she's very ill. It might be like Carmen. It might be like Verdi's Traviata. La Traviata actually means the fallen woman. Again and again, the literature, the imagery, the music, and the drama of the later 19th century into the 20th is, as we would now say, very sexist, sometimes very racist. But you have to enter the spirit of the works of the past to appreciate them and not simply judge them from the present. I was watching one of the lectures you were given the other day about Oscar Wilde, about whom I'll talk in a few moments. If you're judging him, well, he was homosexual, he was gay. Many, many people are. Many men are, many women are. At the time, at the end of his short life, he was condemned for it, morally, and almost obliterated from memory. And then he has revived, and you realize what a great writer he was. So yes, Puccini is obsessed with women. He was a very attractive man, sitting very casually there. As I say, legs, always smoking, stupid man. In fact, died of, I think, lung cancer in his 60s. But what a wonderful legacy he left for us. He was a modern man. People talked about him as the successor to Verdi. After the Verdi, who lived to his late 80s, everybody was looking for his successor, the new Italian composer. There's Puccini in the car there. He was a modern man. He liked cars. He liked going out on boats. He went to New York a couple of times, came to London a lot. He dressed very casually. And he didn't really go in for grandees. When he was given some great honor, some great medal, he sort of joked about it and threw it off a little bit. Easygoing, nice, casual kind of character. When he was writing Madame Butterfly, which is the very beginning of the century, 1900, 101, 102, he was in a car, he was driving. Cars were new then. He loved the latest technology, the newest technology, gramophone records, very early recordings. And he was driving a car and he crashed. No seat belts, no real safety, probably not quite sure which side of the road he should be on, injured himself, could have died. And the whole of the time he was writing Madame Butterfly, he was limping. And one leg was slightly shorter than the other after the operation. He was rather vain. He liked to look good and super cool. I remember I knew his granddaughter a bit, who only died a few years ago. And I remember her telling us, I was with a little group of people, that when he stood up, he found that one leg was a bit longer than the other. And he didn't like that. So into the turn up of his short trouser leg, he used to put some stones in there to try and make it look as though the two legs were the same length. But he's also, I think I said this to you yesterday, I think he was hugely popular. He was a world famous figure. He was celebrated all over Europe, North America, and people played his operas in Australia and all over the world in the early 20th century. And he became very rich. There were recordings, there was copyright law, He knew how good he was, but he wasn't just popular. Many people, Andrew Lloyd Webber, enormously popular, very wealthy for his musicals. But I would argue musicologically that Puccini also had the insight, the creativity of a great composer. He didn't just do tunes. Everybody knows some of his lovely arias. You probably know Nessun dorma, nessun tu purio principes, that Pavarotti made for him. Famous aria from Turandot. He didn't just do arias. He did local color. He did atmosphere. You listen to the beginning of any of his operas, La Bohème, which is about 4 students getting up to, you know, they got no money, but one's got a nice girlfriend, and they try and live a life as young kids at university. And the whole opening of the opera and the opening of the last act of the opera, they're all very orchestrally, musically, vocally, very atmospheric of the rough and tumble of student life. He does atmosphere brilliantly. And he's writing atmospheric music almost as though he was Stravinsky or almost Schoenberg. He kept up with the latest musical, orchestral, harmonic, musicological trends in a way that was almost unparalleled. He's almost writing film music. You go to a great movie and you do and you don't notice the music, because the music in a wonderful film, a film by, you know, one of the great directors of the 1960s, 70s, you know, when film gets to be colored and so on. And the music integrates with the imagery and with the drama. And Puccini had this dramatic sense as well. One opera after another, I say, so many of them are about emphasizing the women. I mentioned La Bohème there, Tosca, tough woman who kills an evil police chief, Madame Butterfly, again and again in his operas, including all 3 of those. The principal character, the principal woman character in particular, doesn't just come on and sing. In La Bohème, the young student, the poet, young bloke who's got a poem to finish and his friends have gone off to a cafe, he's sitting there and suddenly, oh, there's a knock at the door. Oh, who's there? And you hear this girl's voice saying, can I talk to you? Oh, sounds like a woman. Oh, I'm going to let her in. You hear her before you see her. Brilliant, dramatic. It makes you want to see who's there, you know. Tosca, similarly, she's outside the church where our hero is doing a painting, but he's also involved in political work, hiding away a liberal political prisoner friend of his, and she can't get in. Mario, are you there? What's happening? Why? Again, you hear her and you desperately want him to open the door and find out who she is. Madame Butterfly, he's in Japan, he's chatting away about gorgeous Japanese girls and having a drink and all the rest of it. And you suddenly hear this lovely distant sound of girls' voices getting louder and louder. They're coming up the hill from beyond somewhere in Nagasaki. And eventually, as the volume gets larger and they all come on stage, and you finally see all the girls with Madame Butterfly as the principal. So he's got a tremendous dramatic sense of making you wait. And you've got to, you know, if you're thinking you're going to hear a lovely famous aria, you've got to wait for it until it makes dramatic sense to have the aria when it's part of the drama. He was very concerned with drama and with every aspect of opera. Remember the very first thing I said to you yesterday, opera is the multimedia form. It's the attempt to combine poetry, drama, singing, orchestral music, costumes, design sets, and so on. And he was interested in all aspects of this. Endless correspondence with the people who wrote his texts, his libretti. I think, can you add something a little there? Because we need to make the audience worry about this or wonder about that, or let her say something that's going to make every heart melt. And I know the kind of music I'll put it to. That turn of the century, that period from the 1880s to the 1930s, if you like, 1920s, was a tremendous period of opera creativity, particularly in Italy, and many of the operas of Puccini and his contemporaries, I won't list them all, there are a number of quite well-known ones, all writing music of a similar type in a way. They came to be called verismo. Verismo means realism. While you're watching a Puccini opera, you feel it could really be happening, and maybe did. They're all placed in different times and places. Several of them, like La Bohème, in an imaginary France, Paris. This is Paris in the 1840s, but written around just before 1900. Tosca, almost the only Puccini opera to be placed in Italy at all. They're mostly in France or Japan or China or wherever it might be. America, the American West. But Tosca is based 100 years before, 1800, not 1900, at the time of the beginnings of the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon has just won a victory and all the rest of it. So they're placed in all over the world, very often imaginary or historical or legendary, as we'll see when we get on to Turandot. And they all have their wonderful famous arias. Tosca, for example, very famously, it's partly about this tough woman, but it's also about her boyfriend, her man, Cavaradossi, the tenor, who's a painter and a liberal, and he wants to lead the people of Rome against the dangers of the political leader, the military leader, and so on. And he also loves the beautiful woman Tosca, who is an opera singer. And she's the classic, powerful, independent-minded woman opera singer, wears grand hats and "where have you been when I want you" and all that kind of stuff. Again, remember, I told you like yesterday, think also always of the political, the economic, the social, the wider historical context. Why have female opera singers so often been presented as very tough, independent-minded, slightly difficult, the prima donna who wants her way? Think of the reputation of a great singer, like Maria Callas, whom I heard in the early days of her career. And I've played you one or two, like Patti or Melba. And Tosca is like that. But he, the painter, sung frequently by Caruso's exact contemporary, Caruso, also loves Tosca. And the whole story is about how she tries to save him from execution. Caruso was an Italian immigrant, came from Naples. I mentioned how Naples was a great sort of musical center, all the popular Neapolitan songs like O Sole Mio, which you might know. And because he was such a good singer, he was just a working class boy, no real education, but a lovely voice, lovely man, went to America. They adored his voice. And we're in the early years of recording, which meant that Caruso became far more famous than a similar tenor 100 years before. It meant that when Puccini wanted to write an opera based on a kind of mythological Japan or a mythological China, he could actually hear recordings of some Japanese music or some Chinese music. Again, something we'll come on to in a moment. And Caruso, lovely guy, innocent, he was no great intellectual, he couldn't conduct an opera or anything like that. But he was also a very talented cartoonist. He drew everybody. He knew Puccini, of course. He knew the conductor Toscanini. And he drew himself, and he drew himself recording. And you might notice in his own, you see his signature at the bottom, that's Enrico Caruso. And he has paralleled himself singing into the horn, which you had to do in those days. They didn't have electronic microphones or anything, with in the top right-hand corner, the little dog by the horn, which became the sign of the recording company, which was called His Master's Voice. Let me just play you a little bit of Caruso singing from Tosca. This is, he's going to be executed, but Tosca has arranged that it's going to be a mock execution and it won't be real bullets and he'll live. But he thinks it's dawn, e lucevan le stelle, the stars, you know, it's early morning, the sun hasn't even come out yet. And he's so ready to live with this wonderful woman, and tragically, he's going to be killed. Actually, that does happen, he is killed. And Tosca commits suicide at the end of the opera. But just have a listen to this early recording with piano, introduced by the this is 1902 or 1903, I think, very early recording.
Tosca, e Lucia alle stelle, eseguito dal tenore Caruso, Anglo-Italian Concert Company.
Oops, didn't mean to do that, sorry. Back. Amazing recording. Oh, don't do it again. Thank you. You can hear the tear in his voice and the way he'll suddenly speed up about something very emotional. He's in his 30s when he records that, quite young. And you can't simply do a retake in those days, not like modern times with the digital, the conductor with the orchestra will say, oh, could you just do the second half again and we'll link them, no problem. This is a one-off, very early recording by a young man who's pouring everything he's got into an emotional, tragic aria. And when you see that on stage in the dramatic context, if it's well sung, it's very, very moving. You believe it while it's happening. And then Tosca arrives. He's on the battlements of one of the great castles in Rome. And she says, oh, my darling, it's all right. Don't worry. They're going to pretend to shoot you because I've arranged with the head of the police. And the soldiers don't realize this. You've got to fall down as though you were dead. And once they've gone, I'm going to come and tell you can get up and we can escape. And of course, it doesn't happen. It's all the more tragic for that. I mentioned Puccini and local color. That last act of Tosca ends at dawn, very early. It's still dark. The stars are still shining, as he says. And there's all the atmosphere in the orchestration of Rome waking up. You hear the bells of the various churches of the Vatican, and they're all integrated with the orchestration. There's a shepherd boy leading some sheep, and he has a few little things to sing, and the music is appropriate to what Rome would have been like in 1800, with ordinary people wandering around the streets at dawn, somebody lighting the lamps along the streetway and so on. Very powerful stuff. Why were women opera singers so tough as portrayed by the part of Tosca, Floria Tosca, the opera singer in this opera named after her? Remember, if you're talking about some of the great singers, I showed you yesterday, even in the 1600s in Venice, a portrait of an opera singer called Anna Renzi, when we'd been talking about Monteverdi going to Venice. People like Anna Renzi, much later on, people like Patti, Callas, and so on. Remember historically, socially, that really until relatively modern times, and again, something I've said and written about, women were not allowed to take part in politics, not allowed to vote in Western democracies. They were not allowed to own property. If you look at the history of women in the time of all those rather sexist operas, you know, the girl who falls in love and goes to bed with her lover and then finally dies because she's morally punished for her immorality, really. But a girl couldn't earn money. She certainly couldn't become, well, she could earn money. She could be a servant to a grand, rich family. She might, like, as in La Traviata, she might be a prostitute. But she couldn't have an international career. She couldn't be the head of a company of any kind. She couldn't own property. She couldn't vote. If she didn't have a wealthy husband, she could starve. And opera, I would suggest, was the only profession for centuries into which a woman, if she was talented and good looking, and she could network well with powerful people, and she had confidence and good health, could become a wealthy international celebrity. There was no other profession in which a woman could be what a modern international film star or celebrity might be. And therefore, if she did go into opera and she did become an international celebrity, that was very rare. And she could only do that by making sure she had her own way about things, as the Tosca in this opera does, and as Anna Renzi did, and as so many of the great women singers were able to do. Now, let's move on. I've mentioned Puccini's emphasis on women, two types of women in his operas, the tough ones and the rather sweet, loving, gentle ones. He, after the war, after 1914 to 18, he was never very political. He wasn't quite sure who the good people were and who the bad people were. Verdi had been very political. Wagner had been very concerned with German nationalism and so on. Puccini was innocent in a way. As I say, a nice guy, lived his local life, loved going to America, liked going out getting a nice sort of steamboat to go on his local lake, having drinks with his friends, had a nice little house in the country somewhere. And he survived the war, of course. Didn't really affect him very much. After the war, the lovely little village, Torre del Lago, the one with the tower on the lake in which he had been living for quite a while, things got built up. There was a cement factory, and that meant that the air where he lived wasn't so good. Towards the end of his life, he was only about 60, but we now know it was towards the end of his life, he moved to the Italian coast, to a nearby town, not very far away, called Viareggio. Still there today. It's a seaside town. You know, they're all out on the beach today, probably. And a new idea came to him, and he was always doing something new. He had seen a play about ancient China, with supposed ancient Chinese characters, dances, the old ancient empire and so on. And he started setting it to music. And it was, of course, called Turandot. He didn't know anything about ancient China. Nobody in Europe did at that time. But it was a wonderful story that it was exciting to him. Turandot, or Turandot, mostly people call it Turandot. She was a mythological ancient Chinese princess, and everybody was awestruck by her. She was beautiful, she was not married. She was prepared to marry, prepared to give her hand to anybody, a prince, of course, an important person, who could answer 3 riddles, 3 questions, all rather odd, mythological, strange. You know, who is it that is both fire and water? But, you know, odd question. If you can answer all 3 correctly, she will give her hand to you and you can become her consort, her prince, her husband. If you fail, you will have your head cut off and it'll be stuck up on a pole for everybody to see. And it's basically about the crowds in Pekino, used to be called Peking, of course, Beijing, in ancient times, and how they're all excited by the story and who's going to die next, and do you think that one will win, and so on. And he begins the opera very much, I mentioned Stravinsky. I mean, on the one hand, he's all the time using what he thinks of as little Chinese kind of music, or even instruments or harmonies, but it's also very much modern music, atmospheric music. The opera begins in a kind of grand pseudo-ancient Beijing square with the palace and everybody dressed up to look like people used to think everybody in China looked like. But listen to the opening music. It's both Chinesey in a crude 1920s kind of fashion. It's written in the early 1920s. And at the same time, it's got these chords, boom, 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 which could come straight out of an early Stravinsky score, a Stravinsky ballet, Rite of Spring, something like that. And then you've got this man telling the news, people of Beijing, Popolo di Pechino, hear this, our great princess, and so on. And then halfway through that act, they're all talking about her, and she rides through the square. She's drawn probably in a cart with wonderful horses, doesn't say anything. In this opera, you see her before you hear her. She doesn't sing till the next act. But let me just play you the very opening of this extraordinary opera, the last one he wrote, and he never quite, in fact, lived to complete it. I'll just play a bit of the chorus. That female voice is not Turandot. All this is being watched by a handsome young prince, his elderly father from Mongolia or wherever, and their slave girl, Liu, sweet soprano. And Liu is the gentle, shy, loving, honorable soprano, and Turandot is the big, tough. Remember the two types of women that I mentioned in Puccini. And the last scene Puccini wrote was in the final act when Turandot needs to know the name of this prince, and they capture the prince's servant girl, Liu, and she is so loyal to her beloved prince that she, in the presence of the princess, little Liu, won't give away the name of the man she serves and the man she loves, and finally commits suicide. Finally, the very last scene Puccini wrote, you've got the confrontation of the two types of women who dominate his operas. It's a wonderful work in many, many ways. And next time you go to Torre del Lago, where he had lived for so many years, they have a festival there, Puccini Festival, and they might well be putting on Turandot. And just to the right, overlooking the lake, and just to the right of this lovely image, just beyond what you can see, is the house where he lived for something like 20 years. And that's where I remember meeting several times his granddaughter. First time I ever saw a Puccini opera, he'd only been dead about 25 years. So it's getting into modern history. I might add, incidentally, of course, there are a lot of other operas that tell you something or other, a bit imaginary about China. I mean, there was one in the 1980s about the time that Nixon of America, President Nixon came and met Mao Zedong in China, and there was an opera about that meeting by an American composer, John Adams. There's also an opera I saw in New York about 10 years ago. Tan Dun, Chinese, wonderful Chinese composer, wrote an opera called The First Emperor, which was really about the original unification of China under the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, if I pronounce it correctly, with Domingo in the title role. Not the greatest opera ever written, but nice to know that something like that could be created and that the Metropolitan Opera New York was prepared to put it on. So the world is getting smaller. We are living in a much more multicultural world, and everybody really in the 20th century, people like Puccini, people like Richard Strauss, they really brought opera to a wider and wider audience. Now, I know you've been hearing lectures about Oscar Wilde, and one of the things I mentioned to you yesterday, that it's the very, very few operas, hardly any, which are simply based on the text of a play. They can't be. Plays are usually much too long. However, Richard Strauss, who lived right through till 1949, I remember when he died, one of his early operas, very much Puccini-ish, but German romanticism, post-Wagner romanticism, written in the early part of that century, about 1905, just a little after Oscar Wilde had died, is almost entirely based on the text of a play by Oscar Wilde, Salome. Oscar Wilde wrote this play, Salome, short play, about this supposed biblical figure, this woman around the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago. She's the daughter of one of the Herod kings of Palestine, and he's having a grand party with all the great Roman generals there, and this girl is bored and she goes off around the palace and she hears this voice, and it turns out to be the voice of John the Baptist, who's been imprisoned. John the Baptist is warning all these sinners that the Son of God will soon appear. It's difficult territory. I mean, it's sexist, it's Orientalist, because what Salome eventually does, when the king and all people come down, they say, look, I know you've been talking to John the Baptist. Don't listen to a word he says. He's trying to subvert our world. He's evil. Dance for me, Salome. You're a pretty sexy little girl. Come and dance for all our friends at our party. And eventually she agrees on condition that he will give her whatever she wants for dancing. And he expects she'll ask for a bottle of wine or something. But she doesn't. She asks for the head of John the Baptist on a silver plate. And she then kisses it. I mean, it's really disgusting. So many things you can't do today. I mean, it's sexist. It's brutal about God, religion, Jesus, the Bible. It's Orientalist. In her dance, she throws off her 7 veils until she's naked. And yet it's an amazing, powerful piece when you listen to it. Let me just play a little bit of the dance of the 7 veils, the music to which she dances. Gets much slinkier later on. and so on. And she shocks everybody by insisting on having the head of John the Baptist. It's blasphemous. The play, Oscar Wilde's play, would have been forbidden in England. He wrote it, in fact, in French. And Strauss set a German translation of it. And when the opera first appeared on stage in England, for example, they couldn't have an imitation head. They simply had a tray with red stains that looked a bit like blood. It was too shocking. And remember that in Britain, in this country where I am, there was censorship of all kinds until nearly 1970. When you see her holding up the head, I mean, productions of the opera look like that. It is both shocking, disgusting, and overwhelming when you see it. And it's literally the text of the Oscar Wilde play. Do you remember, I think in one of the Oscar Wilde lectures, you had a reference to Aubrey Beardsley, the artist at the same time of Oscar Wilde. And there he is doing a couple of his famous drawings of Salome drooling, sexually drooling over the head of John the Baptist. People used to make fun of it, of course, as a way of avoiding how horrible it is. There was even a cartoon of Strauss having his head cut off. And you'll notice that out of his head are falling a lot of musical notes, which in its own way is quite funny. There were other operas based on Oscar Wilde as well, incidentally, a couple by a composer called Alexander Zemlinsky, who composed The Dwarf, based on a short play by Oscar Wilde called The Birthday of the Infanta, and another one called The Florentine Tragedy. But by and large, operas don't simply set play text. It's much more complicated than that. It's absolutely got to be. Let's move towards the end. I mentioned that by the 1920s, certainly, opera is becoming much more widely popular worldwide. There is recording. All the famous singers, and I played you several recordings from the early 1900s, Caruso and so on. By now, by the mid-1920s, there's electronic recording. Later on, there are long playing records and so on. And now, of course, we have the very technology that I'm speaking to you on. You can, see and hear all sorts of music digitally. But in those days, somebody like Patti, whom I mentioned to you, the one who played the first Juliet in the opera at Covent Garden, she, in the 20th century, she's in her 60s, she's a bit too old, they're not brilliant, but she's recording. And the recordings are selling. There's film. Even in the days of silent film, 1915, there's a film by one of the famous American directors, Cecil B. DeMille, of the opera Carmen, with a lovely famous American singer in it, Geraldine Farrar. And while you went to see that film at a cinema, it was a silent movie, there'd be a pianist playing music from the opera Carmen, which meant that wherever the film went, people went to see it. They wanted to know the real music from Carmen. Wherever Geraldine Farrar was singing, they would go and hear her, and opera becomes more widespread. It gets relayed on the radio. The American New York Metropolitan Opera starts relaying its operas on the radio back in the early 1930s. Nowadays, they relay them live on cinemas around the world. Well, they don't right now because everything's closed. We're in an interesting period. I'll sum up in a moment what it's like looking back over opera at a time when there almost isn't any going on anywhere. It was hugely popular politically. All the great figures, Mussolini in Italy, who gave Puccini a great honor, tenor senator for life, Stalin in the Soviet Union, Hitler loved opera. He loved Wagner. He wasn't wrong. I also love Wagner. Here he is at the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth in Germany. And next to him, smiling, is Winifred Wagner, daughter-in-law of the great composer. And she was English born and went to Germany as a kid. and she became very, very friendly and close to Hitler. In 1969, I went to Bayreuth, spent a week doing interviews with her. She's a highly intelligent, interesting, thoughtful woman, never apologized for the evil of Nazism, but recognized that Hitler, in his own way, loved and appreciated the German arts, but took everything to a kind of dangerous, mad political extreme. Hitler sent some of the German troops to see Wagner operas, even during the war. Richard Wagner Town welcomes, grüßt, the guests of the Führer. Those poor fellows had to go and sit through many, many hours of Wagner when they probably wanted to go and have a good drink of beer somewhere and tell silly stories. Of course, the war, World War II, was horrific, a whole story there of opera houses closing, being destroyed. That's the opera house in Munich, where many of Wagner's operas had their premieres back in the 1860s, destroyed in the early 1940s by Allied bombing. Everything was destroyed. And then after the war, you begin to get a revival of opera. Our own British Benjamin Britten, who wrote the most famous opera, was probably his first major one, which was Peter Grimes. Wonderful, moving opera, not about great grandees, but about a fisherman whose young boy who's helping him drowns, and was he killed, and so on. Quite moving stuff. A lot of new opera houses. In our own times, my times, and even yours, so many new opera houses have been built, and they're all much more open to a general public. They're not grand old buildings like Covent Garden looking like Greek temples. This is the New York Metropolitan Opera, opened in the 1960s. West Berlin doesn't look like a sort of historic Greek temple, does it? Nor does the Paris Opera House, not the old grand opera house, the Opéra, but the one that was built, opened in the, I think 1989, on the Place de la Bastille, where the Bastille prison had been. Opera became very popular. The three tenors, Domingo, Carreras, Pavarotti, gave popular concerts that were widely videoed. People loved listening to them singing arias. Pavarotti most famously singing Nessun Dorma from Turandot. New opera houses, many around the world. The one on the left is in Copenhagen, Denmark, and the one on the bottom there is Oslo, in Norway, both near water. Countless opera houses, opera companies, opera performances, opera in the park, opera on television, opera on screen, opera in Dubai, top left, opera in Tel Aviv, in Israel, new opera house down there. I hardly need to tell you about the one, the Egg, the wonderful arts center in Beijing with its opera. And it's extraordinary when you think of it that the most famous building in the entire southern hemisphere, I would say, is an opera house, the Opera House in Sydney in Australia. Let me just end by trying to get myself back up and just say a few words by way of conclusion. It's a huge subject. Can you see me? Is that all right? Have I done the right thing? I do wonder at a time like this, when opera and so much theatre has closed down around the world, whether what I'm telling you about is an old historical subject that's now a museum subject. As I said at the very outset, the great operas and opera houses all date back to the 19th century, really. Or will there be a heritage of opera? You've been studying the whole role of heritage. That's something that, like many things in museums, ancient history, a great wall, soldiers, models of soldiers, we've all got them in every country, will become historical heritage worth revisiting. I don't know. Maybe in 50 years' time, I'd like to ask you, Georgina, if I can come back and do these lectures again in 50 years from now, with exactly the same people present, and we'll see what's happened to opera. When I've had a bad night's sleep and I'm depressed, I feel that what I'm really studying and have written about and lecturing to you about is a museum art that's come and almost gone. But when I've had a good night's sleep, and I'm going to be talking to friendly people, I feel that, well, there's a huge global atmosphere, a love of opera. When I was writing my book, I was in touch with somebody in Bangkok. They were putting on Wagner's Ring in Thailand. Half the best tenors in the world are from Latin America, or from your part of the world, indeed, some wonderful ones. So let's hope that the story of opera, it may be 410 years old, let's hope it has another 410 years ahead of it with new composers, new audiences, new buildings, international, global, maybe coming from Mars, and that you, the younger generation, will enter it, enjoy it, and appreciate it, as I've been lucky enough to do throughout my long life. So, addio, arrivederci, ciao, guten Abend, goodbye. Opera's in all the languages. I don't know what it is in your language, but as far as I'm concerned, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Daniel. That was brilliant. I hope it lasts long as well. Do you mind if we have a couple of questions at the end?
If you don't mind, and I'm sorry, I always overrun.
No, don't worry.
But most operas overrun as well.
We just, yeah, exactly. It's a tradition.
Don't mind.
There's just two that I've got here. One is from Lulai Chan, who asks about the social status of opera actors and singers. It seems on one hand, meeting famous singers could be honourable to the upper class. On the other, singers would be a relative inferior occupation. I'm not sure, and I would like to know more about this.
Very good question. When I was your kind of age, opera, violin concertos, you know, the high arts was something that you went to with a very serious face. You were very quiet about. You were hugely respectable. And if you ever actually saw one of these people in close up, you felt deeply honored. I used to collect autographs of all these people. And then gradually, like everything else, it's become more democratized. When there's a relay from the opera, they take you backstage and you have a quick chat with somebody who's just been singing. Oh God, I feel so hot in this costume I'm wearing, but I'm going to have a drink of water. Do you mind if I just go to, you know, the private place? I hope you enjoy Act 2, you know. And same with audiences. Audiences used to dress up very formally, but they didn't behave silently. They would come and look at their friends, and they would wave, and they'd go off to have a drink, and they would nip out, come back for the good bits, because the lights didn't go down. When the lights were electricity and the lights went down, you had to get there on time, you had to concentrate on the stage. And then gradually, in our own times, I'm talking the last 25 years, people have dressed more informally at the opera. I'm talking to you without a tie. If I was talking to you in 1960, I'd probably have put on a tie and a jacket and been all respectable. Now I just feel I'm Daniel, you're whatever your names are, and we're just chatting about something that's interesting. Everything has changed, and opera singers, they're sometimes on the radio, they're sometimes on the television, they chat about their life, they write a little book, they're blokes, they're girls and boys, they're men and women. They do their best, and then they go home afterwards and try and get a good night's sleep that night, like all the rest of us. So it's a good question, and I think the whole social context has changed, so that today, and I'll finish the question on this, anybody running an opera house in London or Paris or New York or Vienna has to do two very different things. It's got to appear elite, superior, important, wealthy people come, they dress, and they donate. They give lots of money to it. At the same time, oh, you can bring your kids along. We're going to have a little kind of educational thing for them. If you want to wear jeans, that's fine. Don't worry. And we can arrange that, you know, they'll tell you where the bus is that you can catch afterwards to get home easily. So they're trying to aim at two different kind of audiences and two different kinds of attitudes towards opera. Hence, elitist and yet populist, all about the same time. very odd, interesting period of world history and operatic history.
Thank you. And we have another one, which is from Zhang Faiyan, who asks, you just mentioned that Chinese people in 1920 watched opera. So do you think Chinese people at the time who struggling with food and clothing understand the meaning of those operas?
Well, there's a whole subject I haven't said anything about, and that's the whole history of Chinese opera, which of course has a long and interesting tradition. And if you forget the stupid word opera and think, music, drama, blah, 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 everything else, well, there's comic opera, there's political opera, there's musicals. If you go to a good American musical about, a couple of people in love and they can't finally get together, or there's a lovely old movie, we're all human beings. We can all understand those things. Opera is the name we give to a particular, initially Italian, but then very much German, French, kind of fully composed work. But opera more broadly, the attempt to bring all the arts together in order to create artistically some aspect of our own lives. Which of us has not been in love, feared death, loved some people, hated other people, worried about it, tried to look good, worried about aging. And this is what all art is about, including that multimedia art opera. And indeed film, I mentioned movies. Film is not live, but it's multimedia, if ever there was another multimedia art form like opera. It's a wonderful German word, time of Wagner, Gesamtkunstwerk. A Gesamtkunstwerk, Gesamt means together, Kunst is art, and Werk is a work. It's an artwork that brings everything together. And which of us, you or me, anybody on the planet, can't enter the spirit of an artwork that is ultimately about all of us?
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Daniel. That was wonderful. Can we get a virtual round of applause again? And just thank you for the last 2 lectures and for being with us and answering our questions.
Oh, thank you for being there.
No worries.
Good luck. I'd love to meet you all one day if it ever becomes possible.
I'm sure it will.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I'll see some of you in half an hour. It's the seminar group B. I'll see you in actually 20 minutes now. Bye, everyone.